They laughed at the message when it first arrived, not because it was unclear, not because it was dramatic, but because it sounded impossible. The order did not promise rescue. It did not offer glory. It did not even pretend there was a way out. It simply asked men to stand still while the world collapsed around them. Many officers read it twice, some in silence, others with disbelief. A few muttered that it was madness, but the name at the bottom of the order left no doubt. Winston Churchill was asking them to hold their ground, no matter the cost. Before we go any further, leave a comment saying where you are watching from and what you think you would have done in their place. And if you want to understand how real people faced impossible choices under fire, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and join the discussion in the comments. The year was 1940. The German advance through Western Europe was not just fast, it was overwhelming. In a matter of weeks, entire Allied defenses had been torn apart. Tanks moved faster than command structures could react, aircraft ruled the skies, and communication lines collapsed under pressure. The British Expeditionary Force, once confident, was now in full retreat toward the French coast. Every road was choked with refugees, broken vehicles, and exhausted soldiers who had not slept for days. At the center of this chaos stood a port city that would soon become critical to the survival of Britain's army, Dunkirk. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops were racing toward its beaches, hoping for evacuation across the English Channel. But there was a deadly problem. The Germans were closing in from multiple directions. If they reached Dunkirk too quickly, the evacuation would be crushed before it could even begin. This was when Churchill's so-called desperate orders were sent. A small British force, reinforced by French units, was told to hold the nearby town of Calais. The message was brutally honest. Their mission was not to win. It was not even to survive. They were to delay the German advance for as long as humanly possible. Every hour they held would buy time for evacuation ships to cross the Channel. Every street defended would mean thousands more soldiers escaping capture or death. Many in higher command circles quietly mocked the idea. Calais was exposed. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and lacked air support. German artillery and armor were already positioned to crush resistance. To some, ordering men to stay there was not strategy. It was sacrifice. One officer reportedly said that no modern army could be expected to fight under such conditions. Others believed the Germans would simply bypass the town, making the stand meaningless. But on the ground, the reaction was different. When the order was read aloud to the men of the Rifle Brigade, the King's Royal Rifle Corps and supporting units, there was no cheering. There was no dramatic speech. There was only a quiet understanding of what was being asked. These were professional soldiers. They knew the map, they understood the situation, and they understood that retreat was still technically possible if they chose it themselves. Churchill did not threaten them. He did not promise punishment. The order stated that they were to fight on and hold the town. What happened next was a decision made by the soldiers themselves. They prepared defenses in ruined streets, positioned machine guns in shattered buildings, and turned narrow alleys into killing zones. French soldiers fought beside them, equally aware that surrender or death were the only likely outcomes. German forces attacked with overwhelming power. Tanks rolled forward under cover of artillery. Dive bombers screamed out of the sky, tearing buildings apart with surgical precision. Entire city blocks vanished in clouds of dust and fire. Still, the defenders held. Small groups fought isolated, cut off from command, often without knowing if anyone else was still alive. Hours turned into days. Each delay forced the German High Command to commit more troops than expected. Units that were meant to push directly toward Dunkirk were instead locked in brutal urban combat. German commanders grew frustrated. What they had assumed would be a quick operation became a grinding fight that refused to end. Inside Calais, ammunition ran low. Medical supplies were gone. Wounded men stayed at their posts. Some positions were defended until the last bullet was fired. When retreat routes were finally cut off completely, there was no panic. The decision had already been made. As evacuation ships began lifting tens of thousands of men from Dunkirk's beaches, the defenders of Calais were still fighting. They could hear the distant thunder of guns and knew exactly what it meant. The time they were buying was measured in lives saved, not miles gained. And as German forces closed in for the final assault, the meaning of Churchill's order became terrifyingly clear, setting the stage for a choice that would echo far beyond the ruins of Calais. The final German assault did not begin with a warning. It came suddenly with renewed fury, as if the enemy command had decided that Calais must be erased from the map. Artillery fire intensified, collapsing what little shelter remained. Streets that had already been fought over were reduced to rubble again, burying the wounded and the dead together. Communication between units was almost non-existent now. Officers led by example because orders could no longer reach anyone. German tanks pushed deeper into the city, firing at point-blank range. British anti-tank weapons, few and outdated, were used until they overheated or ran out of ammunition. When that happened, soldiers resorted to rifles, grenades, and whatever could slow the advance for just a few more minutes. Every delay mattered. Every destroyed vehicle forced the attackers to stop, regroup, and commit more time they could not spare. The defenders knew that Dunkirk was still evacuating. They did not know how many ships had crossed. They did not know how many men had escaped. But they trusted that the time they were buying was being used. That belief kept them standing when logic said they should already be dead. German commanders were stunned by the resistance. Intercepted messages later revealed their frustration. They had expected Calais to fall in a single day. Instead, the fighting dragged on, tying down entire divisions. This unexpected delay forced critical changes in the German timetable. Units meant to close the Dunkirk pocket were now stuck in a city that refused to surrender. Inside Calais, the situation became unbearable. Water was scarce. Food was gone. Wounded soldiers lay where they fell because there were no medics left to treat them. Yet even then, when white flags could have been raised without shame, most positions continued to fight. Surrender was discussed only once, briefly, when it became clear that no ammunition remained in certain sectors. Even then, some groups refused and fought on independently. Eventually, reality could no longer be denied. The last organized resistance collapsed after days of constant combat. Survivors were captured, exhausted, wounded, and barely recognizable as soldiers. They were marched into captivity, unsure if their stand had made any difference at all. Many believed they had been forgotten. They were wrong. Across the Channel, the evacuation at Dunkirk was reaching numbers that had once seemed impossible. Ships large and small crossed back and forth under air attack, pulling men from beaches and shallow waters. Every extra hour mattered. Later, analysis would confirm what Churchill had hoped, but could not guarantee at the time. The defense of Calais had delayed German forces just long enough to allow tens of thousands more soldiers to escape. When news of Calais reached Britain, it was no longer mocked. Churchill addressed Parliament with words that carefully avoided exaggeration, but the meaning was clear. The stand at Calais had been essential. Men had been asked to face near certain death, and they had done so without hesitation. Among the captured soldiers, morale remained strangely intact. Many later recalled that they felt no bitterness toward the order. They understood it. They had seen what was at stake. Britain needed its army to survive, and survival demanded sacrifice. Their role had been to stand where retreat would have been easier, but less meaningful. German officers, in private accounts written later, admitted respect for the defense. Some called it irrational bravery. Others called it stubbornness bordering on insanity, but all acknowledged the same fact. Those men had not fought to win. They had fought to delay, knowing the cost. The story of Calais was not one of victory in the traditional sense. No flags were raised, no territory was gained. But the consequences of that stand reshaped the war. Britain lived to fight another day, and the myth of German invincibility suffered its first serious crack. Yet one question still lingered, both among the soldiers who survived captivity and the leaders who had sent them there. Was the price truly worth it? And how did Churchill himself view the decision that condemned so many to capture or death? For Churchill, the decision to order the stand at Calais was not made lightly. In the days leading up to it, he had received fragmented reports, contradictory intelligence, and constant warnings from his own advisors. Some urged immediate evacuation of every British unit possible. Others insisted that any attempt to delay the Germans was futile. The cabinet itself was divided, not on the danger but on the morality of issuing an order that offered no realistic chance of escape. Churchill understood something brutal about war that few leaders openly admitted. Sometimes survival of the nation required choosing where men would die so that others could live. The defense of Calais was never meant to be heroic in speeches. It was meant to be functional. Time was the currency, and blood was the price. Inside the war cabinet, there were moments of near collapse. France was falling faster than expected. Belgium had already surrendered. Reports suggested that German armor could reach the Channel at multiple points, cutting off all retreat. If Dunkirk failed, Britain would lose the core of its professional army in a single blow. In that scenario, invasion would not be a question of if, but when. Churchill's so-called desperate orders were issued in that context, not as a gamble, but as a calculation. Hold Calais, force the Germans to commit, confuse their command structure, and delay the final closure of the Dunkirk pocket. Even a single day could mean the difference between national survival and catastrophe. What no one could calculate was the human response. Soldiers are often portrayed as either fearless or broken. The reality in Calais was neither. Men were afraid, fully aware of the odds, yet they stayed. Letters written during brief lulls in the fighting, some never delivered, revealed a clarity that defied panic. Several soldiers wrote that they did not expect to return, but hoped their stand would matter. Others asked families not to blame anyone if they did not survive. In German command circles, the Calais resistance created confusion. Reconnaissance had underestimated the determination of the defenders. Reports initially described only light opposition. When that proved false, commanders hesitated. They debated whether Calais was being held in force or whether it was a distraction masking a larger counterattack elsewhere. That hesitation cost time that could never be recovered. The stand also influenced a decision that would become one of the most controversial of the war. As German forces approached Dunkirk, an order was issued to halt armored units for a critical period. Historians would later argue endlessly about the reasons: terrain concerns, overextended supply lines, Air Force confidence. But one factor often overlooked was the resistance at Calais and nearby ports, which exaggerated the perceived strength of Allied defenses along the coast. While the men of Calais endured captivity, Churchill faced Parliament and the British public. He did not glorify the order. He did not hide behind euphemisms. He spoke of sacrifice and survival in the same breath. He knew that the truth would eventually emerge, and that he would be judged not by intentions but by results. Those results came in the form of numbers. Over 300,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk, men who would later fight in North Africa, Italy, and eventually return to Europe, men who formed the backbone of Britain's war effort. Many of them owed their lives to hours and days bought in Calais. For the captured soldiers, recognition came slowly. They returned from prisoner of war camps years later, thinner, older, and carrying memories that rarely translated into words. Some discovered that their families had believed them dead. Others found that the story of Calais had already faded, overshadowed by larger battles and louder victories. Yet among themselves, there was no doubt. They had understood the order. They had chosen to obey it fully, knowing the likely outcome. And in doing so, they had altered the course of the war. But even after the numbers were counted and the history books began to form a narrative, a deeper question remained unresolved: whether such decisions should ever be made again, and how future generations would judge a leader who asked men to stand still while escape lay just miles away. As the war continued, the defense of Calais slowly transformed from a controversial decision into a silent foundation of Britain's survival story. It was rarely mentioned in headlines. There were no victory parades for it, no triumphant footage to replay in cinemas. The men who fought there became a footnote in the larger narrative of Dunkirk, even though their stand had made Dunkirk possible. Within the British military, however, Calais was studied carefully. Officers analysed maps, timelines, and casualty reports. The conclusion was uncomfortable but clear. Without the resistance at Calais, German forces would have reached the evacuation beaches far sooner. The narrow window that allowed ships to operate under constant air attack would have closed. The evacuation would have ended in disaster. Churchill never attempted to erase the cost. In private correspondence, he acknowledged the weight of the order. He referred to Calais not as a victory but as a necessity. To him, leadership in war was not about choosing the option with the least suffering in the moment, but the one that prevented total collapse later. It was a view that haunted him long after the guns fell silent. For the soldiers who survived captivity, reintegration was difficult. Many returned to a country that celebrated endurance and triumph, yet rarely spoke about surrender or capture. They carried the invisible burden of having been ordered to hold a position that was never meant to be saved. Some felt pride, others felt confusion. A few felt anger that surfaced years later, when the distance of time allowed questions they had never asked in 1940. German accounts written after the war offered a strange mirror. Several officers described Calais as one of the most frustrating engagements of the early campaign, not because of its scale, but because of its refusal to end. A battle that should have been resolved quickly instead demanded constant attention, draining momentum at a critical moment. In hindsight, some admitted that underestimating the defenders was a costly mistake. The public memory of Dunkirk grew into something almost mythic. Small boats, civilian courage, miraculous escape. Calais did not fit that story. It was darker, heavier, and harder to celebrate. It involved choosing not to run, even when running was possible. That made it uncomfortable, especially in a narrative built around survival against the odds. Yet the reality remained. Dunkirk without Calais would not have been Dunkirk at all. It would have been a mass surrender, followed by a shattered army and a nation facing invasion without defense. The men in Calais had been the wall that cracked, so the rest could pass through. Churchill himself carried the lesson forward. In later decisions, he showed an acute awareness of how much could be asked of soldiers, and when. He understood that morale was not sustained by blind sacrifice, but by belief that sacrifice served a purpose. Calais had worked because the purpose was real, even if the cost was unbearable. As years passed, memorials were erected quietly. Names were carved into stone. Regimental histories preserved details that popular history overlooked. For families of the fallen and the captured, these acknowledgements mattered more than public speeches. The story of Calais forces an uncomfortable reflection. It challenges the idea that heroism always looks dramatic or triumphant. Sometimes it looks like staying in place, outnumbered, while knowing exactly how the story is likely to end. And as the last survivors aged, one final question pressed itself into the historical record. When leaders issue orders that demand everything and promise nothing, how should history judge both the command and the men who chose to obey it? History eventually answers that question not with emotion but with consequence. The order to hold Calais was never meant to be defended as morally comfortable. It was meant to be understood as strategically decisive. The men who obeyed it were not following a vision of glory, but an understanding of responsibility that extended beyond their own survival. When later generations looked back, the mockery that once surrounded Churchill's so-called desperate orders seemed almost incomprehensible. What had appeared reckless in the moment revealed itself as one of the few remaining options in a collapsing situation. The defense of Calais did not save Britain by winning a battle, but by preventing a disaster that would have ended the war before it truly began. For Churchill, Calais became a quiet reminder of the weight of command. He would later write that the hardest decisions in war are not those that risk defeat, but those that demand sacrifice without certainty of recognition. The men at Calais were never guaranteed remembrance. They were only guaranteed danger, and still, they stood. The soldiers themselves rarely spoke in heroic terms. In interviews given decades later, many described their actions as routine, even ordinary. They had been trained to hold ground. They had been given an order. They had believed that the order mattered. In their minds, that was enough. The extraordinary part was not courage in the abstract, but consistency under pressure, minute after minute, as the situation worsened. The true measure of their choice emerged over time. Those evacuated from Dunkirk went on to form the core of Britain's fighting strength. They carried experience, discipline, and leadership into future campaigns. Without them, later victories would not have been possible. The stand at Calais echoed across years of conflict, shaping outcomes far removed from its ruined streets. Churchill's leadership is often remembered for speeches and defiance, but Calais represents something quieter and more severe. It shows a leader willing to accept hatred, misunderstanding, and future criticism in exchange for national survival. It shows soldiers willing to accept orders that offered no escape, trusting that someone, somewhere, understood the necessity. In the end, the mockery faded, replaced by a harsher respect, not because the order was kind, but because it was honest. It did not promise rescue. It did not disguise reality. It asked men to face it directly, and they did. Calais stands as a reminder that history is not shaped only by victories, but by decisions made in desperation, carried out with discipline, and understood fully only after the fact. The soldiers who chose death over retreat did not do so out of blind obedience, but out of a belief that their stand would protect others. That belief was not misplaced. And in that truth, the desperate order found its justification, written not in speeches or monuments, but in the survival of a nation that lived to fight on.